Imagine this. You wake to the sound of rushing water. Your body is heavy, but you cannot move. The stench of milk and honey clogs your throat. Your arms and legs are pinned, stretched unnaturally apart. Beneath you, the wooden shell of a boat digs into your skin, while another identical boat rests on top, closing you in like a coffin with openings only for your head, arms, and legs. You try to scream, but the sun is already rising, and flies, bees, and mosquitoes descend on you in a living black cloud. This was Scaphism, known in whispers as the boats, a Persian punishment so brutal that even ancient chroniclers hesitated to write it down. It was not merely an execution, it was a theater of death, staged to humiliate, to terrify, and to erase the humanity of its victim. The condemned would not die quickly nor cleanly. They would rot in public view, consumed alive by insects, decay, and hunger. But why invent such a punishment? And who in all of Persian history was deemed so dangerous that they deserved this slow dismemberment by nature itself? To understand, we must step into the violent heart of the Persian Empire, into a court of kings, brothers, and betrayals. The punishment of Scaphism is most famously tied to the reign of Artaxerxes II, ruler of the Persian Empire in the 4th century BCE. His reign was born in blood, for his very first challenge came from his own family, his brother, Cyrus the Younger. Cyrus was no ordinary sibling. Charismatic, ambitious, and trained in the arts of war, he gained loyal Greek mercenaries and plotted to overthrow Artaxerxes. Their clash, the Battle of Cunaxa, 401 BCE, became legendary. Though Cyrus died on the battlefield, his rebellion scarred the Persian throne forever. Rebellion from within the royal family was not something a king could tolerate. In Persian court politics, loyalty was survival, and betrayal was worse than murder. For Artaxerxes, the danger was not only that Cyrus had risen against him, but that Cyrus had supporters still alive. Men who whispered, schemed, and might one day finish what Cyrus had started. One of those men was Mithridates. Mithridates was a Persian noble who had once sworn loyalty to Cyrus. He fought at Cunaxa, where Cyrus was killed. Some accounts suggest Mithridates himself may have struck Cyrus, though others dispute this. What is certain is that Mithridates boasted afterward, claiming responsibility for the death of a royal prince. In a court already riddled with suspicion, such words were dangerous. To Artaxerxes, Mithridates was both a traitor and a liability. He was a man whose loyalty was already broken, whose tongue could not be trusted, and whose ambition might yet flare into rebellion. Ordinary execution would not suffice. Hanging or beheading would end him too quickly. No, Artaxerxes needed a punishment that would serve as a warning, something that would say, "This is what happens to those who betray the king. This is what happens to traitors who dare to dream of rebellion." Thus, Mithridates was condemned to the boats. The Persians had many punishments: impalement, stoning, mutilation. But Scaphism was different. It was not simply about death, it was about transformation. The condemned was turned from a man into an object, from flesh into a feast for insects and vermin. A traitor who once consumed the king's trust was now himself consumed. A body that once carried ambition now carried only decay. A voice that once whispered treason was silenced under buzzing swarms. Ancient writers like Plutarch and Photius recorded this horror. Though some doubted if Scaphism was ever common, its very mention shows the Persian imagination of fear. It was punishment as myth and memory, designed to terrify not just one man, but anyone who might think of betraying the throne. The execution site was chosen carefully. Victims were not hidden away. They were placed near stagnant water in marshes or swamps where insects bred in thick clouds. Soldiers and courtiers would watch. Word would spread. The victim was smeared with milk and honey, force-fed until their body rejected the sweetness. Their skin became sticky, their stomach bloated. Then the insects arrived, drawn by the sugar and the rot. What followed was not death in hours, but in days, even weeks. Some accounts suggest Mithridates survived more than 17 days, screaming, delirious, half-rotten yet still alive. This was the genius and the cruelty of Scaphism. It made the victim's body into a landscape of death, each stage more grotesque than the last. Persia was not the only empire to punish betrayal harshly, but Scaphism reflected something unique about Artaxerxes' reign. His throne had been challenged by his own blood, his brother Cyrus. That wound never healed. In such a climate, treason was not just disobedience, it was a disease, and the punishment had to be more than killing. It had to be a cure. By destroying Mithridates in such a public, lingering fashion, Artaxerxes turned his body into a warning. The lesson was clear. No man survives betrayal. No body escapes the king's justice. You will be broken not just in life, but in death, until not even your corpse remains. And so the boats entered history, a punishment remembered not for how many suffered it, but for how completely it embodied the terror of Persian kingship. They brought the boats out at dawn, two hollowed halves of timber carved from cedar, their surfaces polished smooth by Persian craftsmen who knew perhaps too well that their handiwork was not for sailing rivers, but for drowning men in their own bodies. These were no ordinary vessels. They were coffins shaped like shells, meant not to free the soul upon the water, but to chain it alive into a wooden womb where decay itself would hatch. The Persians called it the boats. The Greeks, who later wrote about it, gave it another name, Scaphism. But here in the palace courtyard of Artaxerxes II, no scholar's words softened its cruelty. The boats waited, gleaming under the sun, as servants tested their hinges, ropes, and joints. They were instruments of a punishment designed not just to kill, but to extend death, to pull it long, like a bowstring, until the body itself became a hive, a theater of crawling things. Mithridates was led forward, stripped bare. His body still bore the dignity of youth, muscle, and vigor clinging to him even in chains. The courtiers whispered as they watched, some with awe, some with terror, and some with satisfaction, knowing they were about to see what few ever lived to describe. The first ritual was not torture of the flesh, but of the stomach. Guards held him down as attendants approached with bowls of milk and honey, so much that the sheer sweetness sickened the air. The mixture was warm, thick, cloying, and they forced it between his lips, tilting his head back until he gagged. He choked, sputtering, the liquid spilling down his chin. When he tried to resist, his nose was pinched, his jaw pried open. He retched, but they did not stop. The purpose was simple yet cruelly ingenious. Fill the body until it could hold no more. The gut bloated, stretched, rebelled. Soon waves of nausea racked him, his stomach heaving, but still the attendants forced the sticky sweetness down. Vomit mingled with honey dripping onto his chest, a grotesque parody of abundance. He gasped for air, and in his gasp the syrup slid deeper into him, a poison of sweetness that would keep him alive even as it destroyed him. The courtiers laughed softly, some in genuine amusement, others because silence would be dangerous under the king's gaze. To refuse to laugh at treason's punishment might look too much like pity, and pity in this court was a crime of its own. When his belly swelled to painful fullness, when his throat could no longer swallow without tearing, they stopped. The attendants then smeared more honey across his skin, over his face, his chest, his groin, his legs. Every patch of exposed flesh gleamed under the sun, sticky and shining like a lure. His skin became both mask and bait, turning him into a living offering to the crawling creatures of earth and sky. Then came the boats. He was laid into the first hollowed half, his back pressed against the smooth wood, his limbs arranged so they did not break. The second half was lowered over him, enclosing everything but his head, his hands, and his feet, which protruded grotesquely from the shell. Ropes tightened around the frame. He could not move. He was wood and flesh fused into one shape, a body-shaped barrel floating in the stillness of the courtyard. The attendants began to push the boats out onto a stagnant pond beyond the palace walls. The water was foul, half-choked with reeds and buzzing with flies. It was no accident. Death by boats did not unfold in a clean river, but in filth, in mire, where insects bred thick and the air itself was heavy with rot. The courtiers followed to watch, shading themselves with silken fans while the condemned was set adrift. By midday, the first swarms had come. Flies, drawn by the glaze of honey, descended on his face, his lips, his eyes. He thrashed his head but could not shake them. His hands twitched, but the ropes held. Soon his breath grew ragged, interrupted by coughs as flies crawled into his nostrils, his ears, even the corners of his mouth. He spat, but the honey only made it easier for them to cling. Inside the boats, his bowels betrayed him. The forced milk and honey fermented within, and the body could not contain it. Waste seeped out, trapped in the wooden cavity with him. The stench rose immediately, a miasma that thickened the air. The waste mixed with honey, forming a sludge that coated his thighs and back, seeping into every crevice. Insects rushed not only to the sweetness, but to the filth, drawn to the living feast the man had become. By the second day, blisters erupted on his skin, where the sun burned unprotected flesh. His lips cracked, swollen with thirst, though the guards returned each morning to force more milk and honey into his mouth. His stomach groaned with the weight of it, diarrhea pouring inside the boat, ensuring he remained alive in a stew of his own decay. It was not death they wanted from him. Death would have been mercy. What Artaxerxes demanded was demonstration, an image engraved in the memory of his court, a warning stitched into the imagination of anyone who might dream of treason. Mithridates was no longer simply a man. He was a stage, a spectacle, a lesson. The buzzing of flies grew constant, a black cloud around his head. Wasps began to appear, their stings swelling his face into grotesque shapes. Worms wriggled up from the pond's edge, lured by the waste seeping through cracks. By nightfall, frogs croaked and fish nibbled at his dangling toes. The boats rocked gently, as if mocking the rhythm of life with the slow dance of dying. Still, he lived, and that was the point. By the third day, Mithridates' body was no longer his own. The milk and honey, once sticky and cloying on his lips, had transformed into a living trap. Flies gathered in black clouds, crawling over his face, his eyelids, even inside his nose. Each time he tried to shake them off, the leather straps dug deeper into his swelling flesh. His arms were numb, his muscles cramped, but the insects were tireless. They searched for openings, his ears, his mouth, the unhealed cuts where the boat's wood had already scraped his skin raw. When he coughed, flecks of vomit dribbled onto his chest, and immediately beetles and wasps landed to feed. The punishment was working exactly as designed. The man was alive, but his body was already a carcass. The honey smeared on his skin had begun to ferment under the brutal Persian sun, filling the air with a sour, sickly odor. His skin was blistered, pink and cracked. Where the insects had bitten, open sores appeared. They were not just bites, they were entry points. Flies laid eggs in his wounds, tiny white specks wriggling into flesh. By nightfall, when the cooler air descended, he could feel the larvae moving beneath the surface, a crawling itch that could not be scratched. He screamed for release, begged for death, but the guards remained silent. Their job was not to kill him. Their job was to keep him alive. By the fifth day, the transformation from man to corpse was undeniable. His lips were split and bleeding, his tongue swollen from dehydration, yet the guards still forced honey and milk down his throat. Each gulp brought choking fits, and much of the liquid spilled down his chest. This ensured that even when he vomited, his skin remained coated in sweetness, a constant lure for vermin. Inside the wooden shell of the boats, his own excrement pooled around his waist and legs, mixing with the sticky mixture. It festered, bubbled, and attracted another layer of life: worms, beetles, and gnats. He could not move, could not push them away. The punishment had turned his body into soil. By the seventh day, the guards themselves had to cover their noses when they approached. The air reeked of fermented milk, rotting flesh, and human waste. Mithridates' once strong soldier's body was bloated and raw, his skin darkened with ulcers. His mind began to fracture. He muttered to himself, reciting prayers, whispering the names of family members long dead. At times he would laugh uncontrollably, then sob like a child. His spirit hovered between life and death, trapped in an endless purgatory of sensation. Every sting, every bite was another reminder that he still lived, though death had already claimed his dignity. The sun did not simply burn his skin, it cooked it. By the ninth day, his chest and arms were covered in sheets of peeling, blackened flesh. Each crack revealed oozing infection, and the maggots inside the wounds were now visible. They squirmed openly, feeding while he screamed. His lips had nearly disappeared, swollen to grotesque lumps. His eyes were bloodshot, crusted with pus, yet he still blinked, still alive, still forced to endure. Guards noted that vultures had begun circling overhead, drawn by the smell of carrion, but the carrion was not yet dead. That was the brilliance and the horror of Scaphism. On the 10th day, Mithridates no longer recognized his own form. The boats held him in a grotesque embrace, wood above, wood below, flesh dissolving in between. His body swelled unnaturally, bloated by infection. Mosquitoes drank his blood freely, leaving welts upon welts. Each breath rattled with difficulty, his lungs filling with mucus. Yet he clung to life. Perhaps instinct. Perhaps the human body's refusal to surrender. no matter how much the soul longed to escape. His punishment had become something worse than execution. He was now a host to hive for countless other lives. By the 12th day, his voice had dwindled to rasps and moans. Guards reported that he sometimes stared at the sun as if it were speaking to him. He called out to Cyrus, his dead prince, begging forgiveness. He cursed Artaxerxes, the king who ordered this torment, and prayed for his soul to haunt the royal court forever. Then he laughed at nothing, a broken sound that chilled even his captors. His mind had turned inward, fleeing from the horror his body endured. But reality always returned, in the sting of wasps, the gnaw of larvae, the crawling of ants through his sores. By the 14th day, his body was not truly solid anymore. His lower torso, submerged in filth within the boats, had softened and collapsed. His flesh was sloughing away, becoming a pulpy mass writhing with maggots. The stench was indescribable. Guards gagged while pouring the cursed mixture of milk and honey into his throat. But they dared not refuse. Artaxerxes had decreed that Mithridates must live as long as possible. His body was an offering to terror itself, a warning carved in rotten suffering. The 15th day marked the point at which his humanity was gone. His face was a mask of sores, his eyelids fused by infection, yet faint movement proved he was still conscious. His belly was distended, pus dripping from open abscesses. The insects no longer had to crawl through openings. His body itself was an opening. Life poured in and out of him. Maggots hatched, fed, and burrowed, continuing the cycle of existence within his dying shell. He was not Mithridates anymore. He was a vessel. On the 17th day, silence finally fell. The guards noted that his chest no longer moved, that the swarm of flies moved freely without disturbance. When they pried open the top of the boats, they recoiled. What remained of Mithridates was not a man, but a grotesque amalgam of bone, liquefied flesh, and crawling life. His soul at last had fled. The punishment had achieved its purpose, not merely killing, but erasing, dissolving, transforming a traitor into the lowest form of matter. For Artaxerxes II, this was justice, a death so slow, so unimaginable, that no subject would dare betrayal again. But for the world that remembered, it became a symbol of cruelty beyond comprehension. Scaphism was not simply execution. It was a theater of decomposition, life stretched into death, one scream at a time. When a man condemned to Scaphism finally died, the horror did not end with his last ragged breath. In fact, for the Persians and for their enemies abroad, the aftermath was often as important as the punishment itself. The death was not private, it was staged, recorded, and interpreted. The executioner's work was only half the story. What lingered was the memory, the trauma etched into the minds of witnesses, the official documents carried back to the court, and the whispers that spread across empires. To watch a man consumed alive over weeks was a spectacle that blended terror with morbid fascination. Ordinary Persians were sometimes brought to see the victims during the later stages. Soldiers, courtiers, even foreign envoys could be escorted past the reeking marsh where the boats floated, roped together and anchored in mud thick with mosquitoes. The reactions were varied. Some recoiled, covering their noses and eyes, unable to reconcile human flesh with the crawling, buzzing mass of insects that devoured it. Others, however, stared in grim silence, their faces pale but their eyes locked, almost hypnotized by the sheer extremity of what was happening before them. There were even whispers that some courtiers found a perverse relief in the sight. So long as Mithridates or some other unlucky traitor was in the boats, they themselves were safe. Children who glimpsed such scenes in passing grew up with lifelong nightmares. Foreign envoys returned home with tales that made Persia seem less a kingdom than a theater of cruelty. For the condemned man himself, the audience was salt in his wound. Even in dying, he could not suffer in private. He became a living warning sign and exhibit of power. Scaphism was not simply brutality, it was also ritualized administration. The execution required scribes to document the daily condition of the victim, how long he survived, what torments he endured, what words he cried out. These reports were sent to Artaxerxes II's court, where they became part of the official archive. The punishment was designed not only to kill, but to create a record of loyalty and betrayal. Guards stood watch in rotating shifts, ensuring no one tried to show mercy by ending the victim's suffering early. Physicians, ironically, were sometimes assigned, not to heal, but to keep the man alive longer. They would feed more milk and honey, patch small wounds, and keep him breathing just enough to extend the spectacle. This turned the process into a kind of bureaucratic torture machine. Every official had a role. Every role reinforced the authority of the king. Even after death, scribes noted the final condition of the body, what state it was in when the boats were finally opened, how much of it remained human, and how much had dissolved into a crawling mass of larvae. Death itself was not the end point. Documentation was. In Persia, Scaphism could be interpreted through Zoroastrian theology. The victim, encased in filth, exposed to vermin, and reduced to rot, was seen as the very embodiment of Druzh'da, the cosmic corruption opposed to Asha, or truth. Treason was not merely political disloyalty, it was a spiritual infection. To let such a traitor die slowly, surrounded by corruption, was to make his body an offering of decay to the forces of evil, while truth and order were reaffirmed in the empire. Politically, the message was even starker. Artaxerxes could not be challenged. His brother Cyrus had raised an army and nearly dethroned him. But Cyrus's ally, Mithridates, caught in treachery, became the perfect scapegoat. By punishing him in the most grotesque and theatrical way possible, the king made sure that any noble watching would think twice before plotting rebellion. The empire was too vast to control by armies alone. Fear had to travel faster than soldiers. Scaphism in this sense was not just a punishment, but a technology of rule. The Greeks, who loathed and feared Persia, seized upon tales of Scaphism with relish. Writers like Plutarch and later Roman historians described the punishment in almost obsessive detail, using it as proof of Persian barbarism. To them, the image of a man trapped between boats, eaten alive by insects, became a symbol of everything decadent and cruel about the East. These stories crossed centuries. By the time Europe rediscovered classical texts in the Renaissance, Scaphism had become legendary, a byword for cruelty. It appeared in moral treatises, in lurid histories, even in plays. Each retelling exaggerated the horror, but always preserved its essence. Persia as a land where kings ruled by turning men into living feasts for vermin. Ironically, this propaganda also ensured Persia's legacy endured. Without Greek fascination, we might never have remembered Mithridates at all. His screams, carried in ink across the centuries, became part of Western imagination. At its heart, Scaphism was about fear as governance. Armies could conquer, taxes could sustain, but only fear could prevent rebellion before it began. By making treason synonymous not just with death, but with an unimaginable ordeal, Artaxerxes and his successors weaponized the psychology of terror. This logic is not confined to Persia. Across history, rulers have found ways to make punishment into a spectacle. Crucifixion in Rome, impalement under Vlad the Impaler, breaking on the wheel in medieval Europe. In every case, the cruelty was not random. It was calculated, meant to send a shiver through the population and lodge itself in memory. Even today, the shadow of Scaphism lingers. We live in a world where regimes still use spectacle public executions, orchestrated trials, media humiliations, not so much to punish the guilty as to frighten the watching crowd. The boats may be gone, but the principle remains. Power survives when fear is stronger than hope. When we speak the word Scaphism today, we speak of more than just one man's death. We speak of a system where the human body became a battlefield between kings and traitors, truth and lies, east and west, memory and oblivion. The boats were never just wood and nails. They were theater, archive, scripture, and weapon. And in their shadows, we glimpse a truth that chills across time. Once fear is enthroned, cruelty is no longer excess. It becomes governance itself.